So, one of the most important discussions in project controls is breakdown structures. And I like to define breakdown structures in a specific way because sometimes it's highly misunderstood or possibly misused, especially in regards to the use within P6. So I'll start with offshore. Being that this is an EPC environment that I usually work in and teach. Um, it's usually three legs of segments: offshore, onshore, and subsea, possibly pipelines, turnarounds, and upstream or downstream is the terminology you'll hear. But here we're going to go over the offshore breakdown structures. So typically, offshore labels their breakdown structures that follow the components of the platform and not necessarily a geographical representation of the work. For example, you'll see topsides, and underneath topsides, you'll see the process units, the living quarters, the flare, the storage, everything up here on the top of this platform. These four legs you see here, they're semi-submersible, which means they float. So everything that's beneath this top platform is recognized sometimes as the hull, quite possibly. Or they call it a semi-submersible. If it's jackets, they're sitting on the ocean floor. If it's spars, they're floating as well. The mooring is the cables that are anchoring it to the ocean floor. And then they usually break out operations and commissioning as its own breakdown structure. This is a two-dimensional hierarchical overview of how the WBS cost breakdown structure is overlaid. Now notice I said cost, and yes, I did say WBS, but in softwares such as SAP or Ecosys or these other softwares, you're going to find that they use terminology work breakdown structure, but it really aligns up with the cost breakdown structure. So on the left hand side, you'll see levels. These levels do not mean schedule levels. It does not mean granularity in the schedule. This is only dictating the breakdown of those codes into smaller pieces. Now, again, you'll see project, and then beneath that, you'll see the level 1.5, level 2 would be the pieces themselves that we overlaid: common, living area, platform, flare, hull. And then as you get further into a breakdown, you'll find smaller pieces, like the platform could be broken out into the jacket and topsides. The flare could probably be broken out, the hull and the mooring, etc. And as you get down to the lower levels, you're going to find the disciplines. And the disciplines are really encoded into every section above it. Even though the arrows only show it pointing to a specific box here, it really just means that this whole layer of disciplines reside in each section. So mechanical has pieces that he has to design in common, in living, in the platform, in the flare, and etc. I just want to make sure that's clear. Then beneath that, the disciplines will have a type of breakdown, quite possibly a deliverable, quite possibly a piece of equipment. But the further you go down, he or she will have a set of responsibilities that is quantifiable. Then beneath that is where you'll find that item, and we're going to call them items, and it'll have an associated man hour. So for example, a piece of equipment in the flare would have an item, and as you get down to the lowest level, level 6 and 7 of this, you'll actually find the work step. So there'll be 14 of those work steps for those 6,000 hours. So it could be the rules of credit of installation or design of that piece of equipment. So this kind of shows an overview of how the expectation is overlaid in a structure that relates to cost, but it is labeled WBS. When we talk about onshore breakdown structures, typically onshore labels their breakdown structures that follow geographical representations of the work. So what that means is this is a plan view, a plot view. For those of you who are not familiar with plot view or terminologies, it's as if we're looking from the sky to the ground. And the larger boxes here are units. Usually they dictate and they illustrate a unit. And the shapes within them actually try and represent the pieces of equipment, or in this case is tanks. So you see this is truck loading here, but it really embeds the tank farm pieces. And then over here you have a different truck loading unit with other process tank farms. Then when you have the process unit, it's also its own block, and within it you have sub areas. So you have certain sub areas, and within those sub areas you'll have pieces of equipment. So in the industry, you'll find terminologies that's OSBL, outside battery limits, and ISBL, inside battery limits. So inside battery limits points to the process areas. This is the areas that either convert the chemical or they support the chemical, but they're intended to represent the units themselves. Then outside battery limits are usually support type of units. They're not really process units, such as these tank farms. They're only meant to hold product for a temporary basis, or hold product, in this case for truck loading. So when then trucks come and transport, they'll take the product from this point forward. And the pipe racks. So the pipe racks run usually along in between these squares that represent the units, and they're pretty much the nerve center of the product. So it's pipes all in a pipe rack, kind of just transporting product from different places, from process to utilities, or utilities in this case could mean cooling water. It's a support type of product. Power, so power is not really a unit, but it does support the process units to operate. So a lot of times they just categorize utilities as OSBL because they're coming off plot somewhere else. Power, wastewater, cooling water, and so forth. The onshore work breakdown structure here again represents a cost breakdown structure, two-dimensional, and I'll explain how that is defined later. And then the levels. The levels do not mean the schedule levels. I want to make absolutely clear. People don't get confused with the level definitions. But the same resides here. You have your project at the very highest. Then you have ISBL, and then the OSBL. And then beneath that, you could have units 1, 2, and 3. And then the OSBL, you could have utilities, the infrastructure, the pipe racks, etc. And then you have the disciplines across all units. And beneath that, you'll have the type of work. And beneath that, you'll then have the items. And then these items are broken out into steps. Most possibly, like here, for construction, a quantity is measured in cubic yardage. So the installation is tracked based on cubic yardage. So if you're putting in concrete, you're tracking how much cubic yardage you've installed. However, in engineering, it may not be cubic yardage. It may be measured by the document. So if you have 47 concrete foundation drawings you have to submit, then you're really tracking the drawings being designed. and you're measuring the rules of credit of that design maturity, and then that rolls up into the mathematics that you track your progress with. So this is kind of a overview of that representation. Again, supports the cost code. Sub C typically labels their breakdown structures that follow the components of the platform and not necessarily geographical representation. So sub C is laid out over all plot of land, which could be considered geography, but the way it's tracked is the sub C, you track the components themselves. For example, we have these wellheads, and then we have these jumper lines. Then you have flow lines and risers, the installation of these risers, and you have all the terminology with the subsea equipment is very interesting. Instead of valves or things like that, they have terminology called plets, plems, wet trees, dry trees. So if it's a dry tree, that means that there is sufficient pressure in the well that the pump, if you will, resides on this top side of the platform, and it just assists the oil or product to get pumped up the lines into the tankers or the platforms. Whereas a wet tree resides on the ocean bottom floor, there may not be sufficient pressure on the well on its natural state that the wet tree assists on pumping the oil up into the lines and up to the platform. And again, the work breakdown structure in association with this cost breakdown structure shows the components, and then beneath the components, the subcomponents, and finally your disciplines in groups. So the umbilicals discipline lead, the umbilicals being the braided cable that sits on the ground, and it has power and control cables within it. It's very, very large cable, but that's what controls the equipment, things like that. And then you have the type of work, the item itself, and then the work steps. Another two types of breakdowns is the phase breakdown and the discipline breakdown. So the phase breakdown is the division of the project phases, E, P, and C, and sometimes they call it C, EPCC, commissioning. And then you have the discipline breakdown. So these disciplines perform work under every phase along the way. So you'll see mechanical has a work scope, and they procure mechanical equipment, and then construction actually installs that mechanical equipment. So that title of the discipline is organized in a way that installs the work. So this is where I have to provide further explanation, but by combining all the breakdown structures, that this forms a three-dimensional cube. So what we looked at previously was a two-dimensional aspect, but really, if you take in consideration all the breakdown structures, this is a three-dimensional space. If you look, our WBS that exists, again, work breakdown structure, is really meant to represent where the physical work will take place. Remember, the components themselves, the plot plan is a physical space. And this layer here, let's say this WBS layer is work package 1. Let's say that's the OSBL scope unit 1. And this is OSBL scope unit 2. And let's say this third level is the ISBL unit X, right? So this whole bottom layer represents that work. Now, if we look at this blue slice represents engineering. So everything that resides in this blue slice of work is tagged and categorized as engineering itself. So in this engineering slice, you're going to see discipline 1, 2, 3. So that means the vertical run of this cube represents, let's say, for example, mechanical. So this is your mechanical discipline. This is your piping discipline. And then this is your civil structural discipline. So that means that this discipline, mechanical, has equipment that resides in the ISBL, OSBL Unit 1, OSBL Unit 2, and ISBL Unit X. And the piping discipline also has to design piping within each area. And the civil structural also has to put in foundations, for example, and steel for units 1 and 2 and X. So their design, it falls in this slice. Then you have the next slice, which is procurement, and procurement has its own slice. And you see here, still follows the discipline structure because mechanical designs it here. Then they go off and purchase that piece of equipment that resides in this slice, if you will. And you have the piping discipline as well that has to design pipe, but then they have to buy it. And then the discipline here, civil structural, they have to order the concrete and the steel. So this falls under the procurement phase that's tagged in this slice. And finally, when you see construction, the construction, meaning the mechanical construction, has to install that piece of equipment. The piping has to install that pipe, and civil structural has to embed and install their foundations in steel as well. Now this layer that I put on the right side called CBS, this is the CBS that represents those hierarchy charts when I talk about the WBS and the cost coding. So this cost coding has a tag number on every area, every discipline, and every phase, so that when money is spent, then that money is allocated to that code, if you will, and this code can then be reported on, can be tracked, can be viewed, etc., so they can see if certain phases, disciplines, or anything in that breakdown structure is providing a forecast of profit or loss, or bad productivity, good productivity. This is the concept, okay? Now this second cube represents what we call OBS in the industry. An OBS is a multiple operating center that could reside quite possibly in another country. So you see this first cube, OBS1, resides in the United States office somewhere in Houston, Texas, let's say. But then we have another office that's helping us in Europe somewhere, or in Asia, quite possibly in India or Italy or Brazil, and they share the workload just as the same. So you see that first slice that shows engineering. They also have disciplines that emulate the Houston office. So when we talk about a mechanical discipline, they also have a mechanical discipline, and together these two might be designing the same piece of work, but they're doing it virtually. They're helping each other. Maybe during the day, the mechanical does a certain part of the data sheets and specs, and then hands it over to the other office. And during the time zone difference on that side of the world, they continue that design, as well as the pipers. The pipers might also be doing the pipe design, but then when they do the pipe drafting, they might send it over to Asia or somewhere, or India, to do the actual drafting itself. And there's a virtual world, that a cloud, if you will, that maintains all this data. Also, procurement also happens overseas. So Let's say, for example, these pieces of equipment are being purchased somewhere overseas, say in Germany, and the piping is being fabricated in a shop somewhere overseas. So even though they're designed here and then quite possibly part of it partially purchased here, the bulk of the fabrication could be occurring overseas, as well as the fabrication itself. So this fabrication would tie to there's tons of fabrication yards in Europe, in Asia, and they put together the mechanical pieces and the pipe pieces, and they have these module sections developed, and they'll ship them back to the U.S. if that's where we're getting the work done. But together, this is called an OBS, and this OBS shares the responsibility and the work scope for the ultimate goal, and that's to get it constructed. Sometimes I reference this as a quantum entanglement, if you will. Even though it's 3D space, we're sharing the same elements in a way. So, to me, the most misunderstood concept of breakdown structures is the thought that a WBS hierarchical structure in P6 is the way to build a schedule, which means it would be a two-dimensional concept, and I'm going to explain that in a second. But the reality is that work breakdown structures are a lot more complex. You have the WBS that represents the geographical space or the components where the work's going to be done. You have the discipline breakdown structure, and then you have the phase breakdown structure, and you have the cost breakdown structure. And let's not forget the OBS, which is the organization breakdown structure, if it applies. So you actually have a three-dimensional space. So what I do is I'll switch screens and I'll show you an example. So if I look at the schedule, when we talk about WBS, it's unfortunate that users that are not familiar with WBS concepts, they only think that this WBS is a hierarchical view of how WBSs are really created. But in fact, it's a lot more complex than that. So this is two-dimensional space. It is not three dimensions. And I'll show you the best way to illustrate that in a schedule is to actually go to, let's see, I'll copy this to make it a little more understandable. And I'll copy this and I'll put it on a spreadsheet so that everybody can understand two dimensions. When I talk about two-dimensional space, spreadsheets are a good example of what two-dimensional space is, because it only has columns and rows. The most you can do is insert columns or insert rows, and on occasion you can run pivot tables, but that doesn't really encompass three-dimensional space. So right now this looks like a mess, but if I was to highlight it so you could clarify some things, you see engineering, and then under that engineering you had the feed part of the design, let's say, of that phase. And then we have a general breakdown, which is just general milestones. And then you have the disciplines themselves. So you have process, and then you have mechanical. Now, underneath process, you have a set of deliverables, which I'll actually highlight flow sheets. So sometimes flow sheets and process are under the same umbrella. So what we've got is underneath process is a set of deliverables as part of the breakdown structure. Now, for everybody looking at this, they might say, well, that's fine. What's wrong with that, right? Well, the problem is this, is they all reside under the feed. And let's say I had multiple units. So I'm going to insert a representation of units for right now. Let's do this. And let's call it, again, ISBL unit 1. And then we're going to have multiple units. So when we go through and try and represent these multiple units, the only thing we can do is copy, let's say, the breakdown structure that we've decided to give it, which is the disciplines underneath a phase breakdown structure, but we're calling it work breakdown structure. And then we're inserting it into underneath the next one and the next unit. You see, I can only insert columns and rows. So this means that my organization breakdown structure becomes very rigid because I'm doing it in a two-dimensional space. And this list can grow exponentially large and confusing because I'm using the WBS as an all-encompassing breakdown. And what that means is I'm using my WBS as to include phases. If I collapse all, you see, I've got my phases, phase breakdown structure, and I'm also using it for my discipline breakdown structure. You see? So this WBS, which is meant to be geographical or component-based breakdown, that's the intent of the WBS. I went ahead and used it to show my DBS and my PBS, right? And my, my phase breakdown structure and my discipline breakdown structure. So this can be very confusing, large, and it can, if you have multiple units, then it gets really, I'm not going to call it trashy, but it's the overuse of this WBS, and it has to do with the software itself has become so intuitive and easy that in 2008 P6 came out, roughly in that time frame. Before was P3, and P3 was rather rigid, and the only way you could modify your WBS is if you really had a real good understanding of WBS breakdowns. So I myself am guilty of using it in this way because it's convenient. But is it really correct? I'm really superimposing a lot of things in one thing, and it's probably not the best approach. So I try and compromise here if the project is large, and I try to do it in a way that's more intuitive and flexible. And by doing that, what I use is activity codes. So even though the schedule is broken out as that WBS, sometimes the clients ask for this in this specific way. But I use activity codes to give me flexibility. And what does that mean? That means that in my code structure, I can group and sort in any way, shape, or form. Whereas currently, you see, my WBS structure is broken out in a way that it only represents that hierarchy. And if you try and group and sort by doing different levels, it gets really sloppy looking and very rigid. But if I had activity codes here, then I can group and sort in any way. So let's say a project manager wanted to see, I want to see disciplines, then units, and then other information. I can do that by using these breakdown structures as opposed to the WBS. You see, instead of this hierarchical view, I can just say, you know, give me the main areas first, and then give me the disciplines. Well, let's do it different. Let's say disciplines, and then the areas. I want to see the main areas, OSBL, ISBL, and then uh, the actual units themselves, the process units. So if I do this, then now I have a different perspective. If the client wanted to see civil structural and track their work independent of all the other disciplines. You may have superintendents that just want to see their scope of the work in a very clean way. They don't want to see the entire schedule and then go through 147 pages to find bits and pieces of their work. So you can group and sort and customize breakdown structures by use of codes, and that's all dictated here. And you can filter by these codes as well. So you could filter out all the work scope that belongs to a discipline. And this is beneficial to the project. This is beneficial to you. This is beneficial to others. You can track the work. You can put in your hours. So it allows the flexibility of maneuvering that data in a way that represents manageable pieces of the work in a very flexible way. Again, the codes is your three-dimensional space. So when we go back to my slide deck, that code, the code structures, the use of it is what allows me to do this three-dimensional space, and not so much the two-dimensional space. You see, this two-dimensional space cannot superimpose all the encompassing breakdown structures. So if we end up going a little bit further, which I won't on this video, and talk about four-dimensional space. So when you hear 4D planning, is when they're actually tagging those pieces of work over time. So usually the schedule works in regards with the tagging itself with the model, and then you can track the assembly of those pieces in a four-dimensional space, which is time. So 3D plus 4D is your 4D planning. And so I hope this helps you guys out there get a good visual and understanding of breakdown structures.